If I asked you to imagine an ancient person reading, say Alexander the Great, what do you imagine he's holding in his hands? You probably imagine something like we use today, what we call a book. But in fact, he was far more likely to be reading from a scroll. Scrolls, whether made of parchment or papyrus, were the book format of choice in the ancient world. Scrolls are mentioned very often in the Bible. The prophet Isaiah, in an apocalyptic vision, imagines the heavens being rolled up like a scroll. And you can see scrolls in the art of ancient Greece and Rome and Egypt. And if you go to a synagogue today, you will see the Torah being read from scrolls. But scrolls were, of course, not the only format available. From about the 1st century on, we see a new format emerging, the format that we have in our modern books. It's called the Codex. Here you have parchment or papyrus, or in modern times, paper, being folded over and stitched together and sometimes bound. And the writing, of course, here was on both sides of the page, not on one side only. You can see a really nice reconstruction of a codex here next to me. Many of these codices would have been kept in leather covers, as we'll see in a later video. You can see why a codex might be particularly useful. You can access the text it contains at any point very easily, without the cumbersome rolling and unrolling of a scroll. And it's more cost effective too, because you're writing on both sides of the surface. So we see the codex being adopted early on by administrators for things like tax records. But the codex is definitely the less prestigious book format. In our times, we could think of the difference in prestige between a flimsy booklet or magazine and a hardback book. But the scroll remains the fancy option for your literature or your religious texts. Except, that is, for a new and very strange movement called Christianity. Christians are early adopters of the Codex book format for their scriptures. When they write texts of the Old and New Testament, they write them in this format. And they do it in such abundance that when scholars come across, for example, a text of the Old Testament written in a codex format rather than on a scroll, they can be confident that it was written by and for Christians rather than in a Jewish context. The reasons for this adoption are not entirely clear, but there are some possible explanations. Simple poverty might be part of the answer. A new and fragile movement in its early days might not have had access to the funds required for making deluxe scrolls. And so even later, when wealthier people joined the Christian movement, maybe they simply stuck with this early, cheap option. It's possible too that it was chosen for easy access to various parts of the texts. If you read the Acts of the Apostles, you'll see the Christian movement growing up in a context of debate. There are so many examples in synagogues and lecture theatres and so on of debates taking place with appeal to the Old Testament. And you can see in that context why the Codex would be more valuable than the cumbersome scroll. Whatever the reason, I find it fascinating that the Christian movement opted for and stuck with the less prestigious option for the format of their sacred books. If we were designing a new religious movement today, we might be very concerned with slick presentation, with nice web design, and with deluxe books. But that wasn't, it seems, the concern of the early Christians. We might even imagine that they were so confident in the content of their texts that they cared little about presentation.